Operation Market Garden, Battle of Arnhem Bridge, 1944. A gentle autumn hush rests over the Netherlands in 1944 as the wind drifts softly along the quiet banks of the River Rhine. Beneath the arches of Arnhem Bridge, the water moves with a calm, steady rhythm, a sound that feels almost like the heartbeat of a city holding its breath. And in that stillness, history waits. Tonight, we return to those restless September days, when the Allies set in motion a bold and hopeful plan, Operation Market Garden, an attempt to push beyond German lines before winter closed the skies once more. In the late summer of 1944, the Western Front entered a moment of transition, one filled with possibility, uncertainty, and the quiet sense that history itself was shifting. After months of brutal fighting in Normandy, the Allied armies had finally broken free from the hedgerows and the narrow lanes that had slowed their advance. The German retreat from the Falaise Pocket in August left thousands of soldiers dead or captured, their armored vehicles abandoned along the roadsides, their divisions scattered and exhausted. For the men of the Allied forces pushing northeastward, the speed of movement felt almost unreal. Town after town fell with little resistance. Columns of tanks rolled through France, Belgium, and Luxembourg, often greeted by civilians who welcomed the rapid Allied advance. But beneath the celebratory spirit, a more serious problem began to take shape. The Allied advance had been so rapid that the logistical system underpinning it could no longer keep pace. Supplies had to travel hundreds of miles from the beaches of Normandy, and the few major ports available were strained by the volume of fuel, ammunition, equipment, and food required to sustain millions of men in the field. Antwerp, the largest port captured intact, could not yet be used because German forces still occupied the Scheldt estuary, controlling the approaches and preventing Allied ships from entering. Fuel shortages began to throttle the speed of the armored units. Some tank crews recalled receiving far less fuel than required, barely enough to reposition their vehicles, let alone advance at full speed. At the Allied High Command, this strain led to a deeper strategic question. The German army seemed vulnerable, its defenses weakened, its morale shaken. Yet the Siegfried Line still stood along the German border, its concrete bunkers and anti-tank obstacles forming a formidable barrier. Any attempt to breach it directly threatened high casualties and a protracted fight. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, commanding all Allied forces in Western Europe, favored a broad front strategy, advancing evenly across the line to prevent the Germans from concentrating their forces. But Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, commander of the 21st Army Group, saw an opportunity for something more daring, a single, decisive thrust aimed at ending the war months earlier than any broad front approach could hope to achieve. Montgomery believed that if the Allies could secure a crossing over the Lower Rhine, they could bypass the Siegfried Line, open a path into the Ruhr, and strike at the industrial heart of the German war machine. He argued that a bold maneuver, executed with speed and precision, could collapse German resistance before winter arrived. The idea was audacious, unorthodox, and far riskier than anything attempted since D-Day. It required not only the largest airborne assault in history, but also a tightly synchronized ground offensive, moving along a single highway through narrow Dutch terrain. This proposal became the foundation of Operation Market Garden. The plan consisted of two interconnected parts. Market, the airborne operation, would be led by the 1st Allied Airborne Army under Lieutenant General Louis H. Brereton. It called for dropping 3 airborne divisions deep behind enemy lines across a 60-mile corridor in the Netherlands. The goal was to seize a sequence of key bridges, each one essential for maintaining the flow of tanks and trucks that would follow. The U.S. 101st Airborne Division, commanded by Major General Maxwell Taylor, would land near Eindhoven and secure the first group of bridges. Further north, the U.S. 82nd Airborne Division, under Major General James Gavin, would capture the long bridge over the Maas at Grave, hold the strategically essential Grosbeek Heights, and then take the Wall Bridge at Nijmegen. At the northern end of the corridor, the British 1st Airborne Division, under Major General Roy Urquhart, would land near Arnhem, advance into the city, and seize the final and most critical bridge across the Lower Rhine. Supporting them, though scheduled to arrive only after landing zones were secured, was the Polish 1st Independent Parachute Brigade led by Brigadier General Stanisław Sosabowski. Garden, the ground offensive, would be carried out by Lieutenant General Brian Horrocks and the British XXX Corps. Once the airborne divisions were on the ground, Horrocks's tanks, led by the Guards' Armored Division, would race forward along Highway 69, a narrow road raised above surrounding fields of marsh and farmland. The objective was straightforward: link up successively with each airborne division, then push all the way to Arnhem within 48 hours. If successful, the operation would create a solid Allied corridor running deep into the Netherlands, culminating at a bridgehead across the Rhine. At the center of the plan stood a hierarchy of commanders, whose roles intertwined across air and ground. Montgomery provided the strategic direction. Brereton oversaw the complex scheduling of aircraft, gliders, and drop zones. Horrocks prepared his armored units for one of the fastest, most difficult advances ever attempted by British forces. And at Arnhem itself, Urquhart held responsibility for the division expected to face the toughest resistance. His advance would be led by seasoned officers: Brigadier Gerald Lathbury, commanding the 1st Parachute Brigade, and Brigadier Gerald Hicks, leading the 1st Air Landing Brigade. Their coordination would be essential, for the drop zones assigned to them lay several miles west of Arnhem, forcing troops to march into the city on foot. The reasons for these distant drop zones were rooted partly in safety and partly in logistics. German anti-aircraft defenses around Deelen Airfield north of Arnhem were known to be strong, and planners sought to avoid exposing transport aircraft to concentrated flak. But this decision introduced a new vulnerability. The airborne forces would lose the initial advantage of sudden arrival at their objective. Once on the ground, they would need to navigate a complex mix of open heathland, wooded areas, and residential neighborhoods before reaching the bridge. In the time it took them to advance, German units could reorganize and respond. This risk was compounded by a more serious issue. German strength in the Arnhem area had been underestimated. Intelligence from ultra-decrypts and aerial reconnaissance indicated that the 2nd SS Panzer Corps, specifically the 9th SS Panzer Division Hohenstaufen and the 10th SS Panzer Division Frundsberg, had moved into the region to rest and refit after Normandy. Although under strength, these divisions still possessed tanks, self-propelled guns, and experienced infantry. Dutch resistance sources confirmed their presence, but some senior Allied planners dismissed the reports as exaggerated. Lieutenant General Frederick Boy Browning, deputy commander of the 1st Allied Airborne Army, reportedly suggested that while armored units might be present, they were unlikely to pose a decisive threat. Planning unfolded quickly, perhaps too quickly. With the urgency of maintaining momentum into Germany, there was little time for rehearsals or for refining the coordination between air and ground elements. The airborne assault had to be performed in waves over 3 days due to shortages of aircraft. This staggered arrival risked leaving early units isolated. Furthermore, British airborne radios had a history of malfunctioning, and during training exercises, many sets had failed to transmit across even modest distances. Still, the operation proceeded with the assumption that communication, though imperfect, would suffice. Terrain added its own complications. Much of the Netherlands south of the Rhine consists of low, marshy fields divided by dikes and canals. Highway 69, the path designated for XXX Corps, ran along a raised embankment. Any vehicle disabled along it, whether from enemy fire or mechanical failure, could block the entire route. Off-road movement for tanks was nearly impossible. The success of Market Garden therefore depended on a long, single-file advance remaining unbroken for its entire length. Yet despite these concerns, the spirit surrounding the operation retained a sense of optimism. Many soldiers believed they were participating in a decisive effort, one that might bring an end to the war. Paratroopers joked and sang as they prepared their equipment. Tank crews of the Guards Armored Division spoke proudly of the speed with which they expected to reach Nijmegen and Arnhem. Even those aware of the risks felt a sense of obligation to attempt the bold maneuver. For months, the war had been defined by grinding attrition. Now perhaps a single stroke might change everything. At Arnhem, Major General Urquhart spent the final hours before the mission reviewing maps, assessing routes, and studying the German order of battle as best he could. His brigadiers, Lathbury and Hicks, did the same. The plan required Frost's 2nd Parachute Battalion to push straight into the city and reach the northern end of the bridge on the first day. Other units would secure perimeter positions, hold back counterattacks, and prepare for the arrival of the Poles. But nothing at Arnhem would prove easy. The drop zones were distant. The terrain was fragmented. The Germans, far stronger than expected, were already alert and reacting. And yet the mission remained, the hope of seizing the bridge, holding it, and opening a corridor that might bring victory within reach. As Sunday morning dawned on September 17, 1944, hundreds of Allied aircraft filled the sky. The engines of C-47 Dakotas hummed steadily, towing gliders and carrying thousands of paratroopers toward the Dutch countryside. Beneath them, the fields, rivers, and towns of the Netherlands lay calm, unaware of the scale of the operation about to unfold. For the men preparing to jump, the mission ahead seemed at once clear and uncertain, a combination of precise objectives and unpredictable dangers. Market Garden was beginning, and with it, the attempt to seize the bridges that would shape the outcome of the campaign and the fate of the war in Western Europe. The morning of 17th September 1944 arrived with a pale silvery light drifting across the fields of eastern England. The air was cool, tinged with the scent of dew settling over steel, canvas, and the worn leather of airborne gear. Paratroopers moved across the runways of their departure airfields with measured steps, shoulders rising and falling under the weight of parachutes and equipment bags. Mechanics pushed the last crates of ammunition into glider fuselages. Pilots leaned against the noses of their Dakotas, checking maps already creased from repeated folding. For weeks they had trained for this day. Now the long-prepared armada, thousands of aircrews, paratroopers and glider pilots sat ready for takeoff. As engines growled to life, the early haze vibrated with the familiar hum of the C-47 Dakota. The aircraft began to roll forward in slow, confident lines, propellers carving soft circles through the morning mist. One after another, they rose from the runways, forming immense aerial columns that stretched for miles across the sky. Far below, the flat green of the English countryside slowly slipped away, replaced by the darkening blue of the North Sea. Inside the aircraft, men sat in 2 rows along the cabin's length, their helmets brushing the olive-drab interior, their boots tapping lightly with each tremor of the fuselage. Wind hissed through gaps in the doors. Some paratroopers breathed slowly, eyes closed, rehearsing their part of the operation, one of the largest and most ambitious airborne assaults ever attempted. Others stared out the small circular windows at the formation around them, wings glinting in the sun, gliders in tow, their long ropes cutting faint lines across the sky. Voices were quiet. Occasionally a corporal whispered a reminder about landing procedures or pointed out a landmark below. The engine's deep vibration worked like a lullaby, steady and monotonous, even as each man understood the risks ahead. As they crossed the Dutch coastline, the landscape changed. Dikes and canals traced careful lines across the earth. Rows of trees formed near-perfect corridors along country roads. The Netherlands in early autumn presented a plain of green meadows and shimmering waterways, all peaceful from above. Yet the paratroopers knew German forces were dug in across that same countryside, waiting, listening, preparing. At precisely the scheduled hour, the first wave of paratroopers and gliders descended through the clear afternoon sky. Below them, the landing zones west of Arnhem stretched open and flat, heaths, meadows, and cultivated stretches of farmland chosen for their accessible terrain. The British 1st Airborne Division, tasked with reaching the Arnhem Bridge, found themselves dropping 8 to 10 kilometers from the objective. This distance had been known beforehand. Closer landing zones had been rejected due to heavy concentrations of German anti-aircraft guns, especially around the airfield of Dielen. The choice meant the division would need to march quickly toward the bridge, moving along narrow roads that wound through residential districts, woodlands, and gardens. Parachutes blossomed in the sky like hundreds of white flowers drifting in gentle currents of wind. Gliders followed, their long wings slicing down in graceful arcs, skidding across the grass as dust and dry earth lifted around them. The landings themselves went remarkably well. There were crashes, snapped tow ropes, and fires from aircraft brought down by German flak, but the majority of the division touched down intact. The light that afternoon was soft, glowing with the warmth of early autumn sun, and for a moment, as the British collected their weapons and assembled into columns, it seemed the plan was unfolding with precision. But the challenges appeared almost immediately. The drop zones lay far from Arnhem's center, requiring a long approach march through terrain unsuitable for rapid movement. The British reconnaissance jeeps, which were meant to race ahead to the bridge and seize it swiftly, encountered a German blocking position within minutes of departure. The unit was forced to withdraw under fire, losing the element of speed on which the success of their task depended. The paratroopers pressed forward on foot instead, but their progress slowed quickly as German resistance stiffened. Worse still was the radio situation. Many of the British sets malfunctioned as soon as the division attempted to establish communication. Some could not transmit. Others transmitted only a short distance before signals dissolved into static. Officers attempting to coordinate movements found themselves cut off from other battalions. Messages carried by runners were delayed or lost. Plans that required tight synchronization began to unravel. And in the midst of this friction, General Roy Urquhart himself became separated from his headquarters, forced to take shelter in a Dutch house for hours as fighting passed through the surrounding streets. Still, the battalions pressed toward Arnhem. The 1st Parachute Brigade advanced along 3 principal routes: a northern road through wooded districts, a central road lined with suburban houses, and the southernmost path that trailed the Rhine. The atmosphere grew tense, the soft pastoral scenes of the countryside giving way to the sharper sounds of war, occasional rifle shots echoing from distant windows, bursts of machine gun fire, and the thump of mortars landing closer with each hour. Civilians watched from behind curtains or waved quietly from gardens, offering buckets of water or whispered blessings as the British passed. One formation advanced faster than the rest. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost's 2nd Parachute Battalion moved along the southern route, weaving through gardens, narrow lanes, and small bridges that crossed canals and side streams. The men kept a steady pace, knowing that every minute mattered. German patrols harassed them, but the battalion maintained discipline, slipping through the outskirts of Arnhem as twilight approached. Fires burned in distant buildings. Smoke drifted over the rooftops. The bridge, their target, lay just ahead, its steel arches catching the fading sunlight. By early evening, Frost's men reached the northern ramp of the Arnhem Road Bridge. It rose before them like a silent titan, stretching across the Rhine in a long, elegant span. The southern end appeared to be held by German units, but the northern access remained open. The British seized buildings around the ramp, barricading windows with furniture, reinforcing doors with sandbags, establishing firing positions overlooking the road. Approximately 700 paratroopers dug in around the immediate area. They were to hold the bridge for 2 days, long enough for the armor of XXX Corps to advance from the Belgian border, link up with them, and transform the Arnhem crossing into the final stepping stone toward the Ruhr. The first German counterattacks were small and probing, a few armored cars and reconnaissance vehicles attempting to push across the bridge. The British responded with resolve. The Piat teams placed themselves in shadowed doorways and narrow windows, firing at the approaching vehicles with surprising success. Several armored cars burst into flames, illuminating the deck of the bridge with flickering orange light. German infantry moved cautiously along the supporting streets, but they were halted by well-placed British machine guns firing from upper floors. Inside one of the commandeered houses, a radio operator managed to relay a brief message through a sputtering line of static. "We are at the bridge. Situation tense, but holding." The words drifted through the airwaves like a fragile beacon. For a moment they reassured the high command. The bridge was in Allied hands. Night settled slowly over Arnhem. The moonlight glimmered faintly on broken glass scattered along the pavement. Damaged vehicles smoldered near the ramp. The distant boom of artillery from the southern front reverberated like muffled thunder. Frost walked between positions, speaking softly to his men, encouraging them to rest where possible. Some soldiers leaned against walls, eyes heavy, rifles across their laps. Others gazed out over the Rhine, watching the dark water flow silently below. Meanwhile, farther south, along the planned corridor, XXX Corps struggled to push forward at the speed required. Their first day's progress had fallen below schedule. German units, remnants of retreating formations, training battalions, and hastily organized Kampfgruppen mounted fierce resistance near Valkenswaard and Sun, delaying the British armor. At Sun, the key bridge had been blown before the Americans could capture it, forcing engineers to construct a Bailey Bridge. Each hour lost meant Frost's battalion at Arnhem grew more isolated. Back in the city, the German command quickly recognized the threat posed by the airborne landings. Elements of the SS Panzer Corps, believed by Allied intelligence to be resting and not combat ready, began to organize. Though these divisions were under strength after fighting in Normandy, their presence in Arnhem dramatically altered the tactical landscape. Armor, self-propelled guns, veteran infantry, all were refitting nearby and could be brought to bear. By the early hours of 18th of September, the northern end of the bridge was encircled by the echo of German preparations. Engines rumbled in the distance. Orders were shouted across squares and alleyways. Frost's men felt the tension growing with each hour. Ammunition was finite, food was limited. Many radio links had gone silent. The division behind them was becoming entangled in street-to-street fighting, cut into isolated pockets with no clear route to the bridge. Inside the defensive perimeter, buildings trembled under occasional shell bursts. Plaster fell from ceilings in soft clouds. Windows shattered with crisp, crystalline snaps. The paratroopers braced for the next onslaught. They cleaned rifles, checked the last anti-tank rounds, filled canteens from household taps. Outside, the night wind whispered through the corridors of the bridge, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke, river mist, and the distant fires of battle. As dawn approached, the men at the bridge understood the gravity of their situation. They were alone, holding the furthest objective of the entire operation, a small cluster of buildings at the edge of a major river crossing. The coming hours would test every reserve of stamina and discipline they possessed. Yet in that cold, gray light before sunrise, there remained a quiet sense of determination. The Rhine flowed beneath them, steady and unhurried. The steel arches above them curved darkly against the sky, and despite the gathering storm of enemy forces tightening around them, Frost's battalion continued to hold fast, their resolve as firm as the very girders of the bridge itself. Meanwhile, the paratroopers at Arnhem clung to their precarious foothold at the bridge. They had expected the armor to appear quickly, rolling up the highway within a day. But by the time the British tanks crossed the New Bailey Bridge at Sun, Frost's men were already exhausted. Ammunition had grown scarce. Many of the wounded had been stabilized as best as possible inside basements or quiet corners of houses, but medical supplies were dwindling. The nights were punctuated by the harsh echo of mortar rounds. The houses where the battalion sheltered grew steadily more battered, windows replaced by jagged holes that invited the cold night air inside. The second day brought even heavier pressure from the German side. Elements of the SS Panzer divisions began to reconstitute their ranks. They dragged forward self-propelled guns and armored vehicles, maneuvering them through the city's labyrinth of streets and alleyways until they could bring fire to bear on Frost's perimeter. The sound of tank treads reverberated through the neighborhood. Even before the vehicles appeared, the men could sense them by vibration alone. Some paratroopers pressed their palms against the floor or walls, feeling the faint tremors like distant thunder. But despite the relentless assault, they held. Elsewhere in Arnhem, the situation had deteriorated further. The other British battalions trying to reach the bridge were repeatedly cut off and forced back. The city became a maze of German strongpoints, roadblocks, and snipers. Whole companies were fragmented into smaller groups as they tried to maneuver through unfamiliar streets. Civilians sheltered in cellars, listening helplessly as firefights burst above them. Fires spread along terraces of houses, sending columns of smoke rising into the sky. The smell of burning timber and brick dust hung over the suburbs like a heavy curtain. Communication almost entirely collapsed. Radio sets crackled weakly, often useless. Runners rarely returned. The scattered paratroopers now fought in isolated pockets, unaware of the position of their comrades, let alone the status of the bridge. The sense of the original plan, once so grand, so meticulously organized, dissolved in the chaos of urban combat. What remained was survival, hour by hour. By the third day, Frost's battalion had begun to shrink in strength. The wounded were now numerous. Many soldiers had not slept properly since the drop. Food consisted of whatever could be scavenged from abandoned homes, tins of beans, biscuits, sometimes nothing at all. The Germans intensified their bombardment using artillery from across the river and heavy guns positioned throughout the outskirts of the city. Roof tiles rattled loose and fell like scattered gravel. Plaster dust drifted down from ceilings. Floors shuddered under the impact of each shell. Even speaking required raised voices, as if through a thick storm. Across the river, distant flashes signaled that XXX Corps was still pushing north. The Guards' armored division had reached Nijmegen, but here too progress slowed. The bridge remained in German hands, and without it, the tanks could go no farther. The Americans of the 82nd Airborne mounted one of the most daring actions of the operation, a daylight river crossing under fire. Men paddled canvas boats through machine gun fire, the river churning beneath them, shells exploding in towering plumes. Many casualties fell into the water, carried away by the current. But the crossing succeeded, and by evening the crucial bridge at Nijmegen was captured. Still, the armor did not advance through the night. Exhaustion, darkness, uncertainty about German positions, and the need to secure the far side all combined to halt the advance for hours that the men at Arnhem could not afford. With no sign of relief approaching, the tension at Arnhem hardened into the sharp edge of the battle's climax, where hope and reality finally collided. The final hours around the northern end of the Arnhem Bridge settled over the British paratroopers with a weight heavier than the smoke drifting through the ruined houses they defended. The men were worn down by days of fighting, their uniforms stiff with dust and dried mud, their hands trembling from lack of sleep. Yet through most of the battle there had remained a stubborn belief that the sound of guns to the south meant relief was coming. It was this belief, more than rifles, more than sandbags, that had held the perimeter together. But as the third day gave way to the fourth, and as the light of another cold morning crept through shattered window frames, that belief began to erode. Operation Market Garden had reached the point where every assumption of the plan was being tested and found wanting. The British airborne had always known the mission depended on speed, coordination, and timely armor. Now inside Arnhem, they were confronted with the growing certainty that none of those things were materializing. The goal had seemed simple on paper: hold the bridge for 48 hours. 2 days of resistance, long enough for XXX Corps to advance along the single highway and break open the route into Germany. But the reality inside Arnhem bore little resemblance to this neat timeline. No supplies reached the bridge defenders after the first day. No reinforcements broke through the German ring tightening around the city. The paratroopers were not holding the bridge for 48 hours. They were fighting well beyond that mark, with less of everything and against more than anyone had predicted. What they still had were the sounds of distant battle. Artillery rumbling near Nijmegen, the echo of engines, the muted clatter of machine guns, somewhere down the long corridor. At first these sounds had brought hope. Now they arrived like faint reminders of a struggle too far away to matter. The veterans among Frost's men understood the meaning. Behind the strange pauses in the noise, the armor had slowed, delayed by terrain, demolitions, and stubborn German defenses. Even without radio confirmation, they could read the silence. Communication failed almost entirely. Radio operators hunched over their sets, twisting dials, murmuring call signs into headsets, only to hear wavering static in response. Messages that should have flowed between battalions evaporated into the air. Units that were supposed to act as a single coordinated brigade now fought as isolated pockets scattered through a maze of burning streets. Some groups were only a few houses apart, yet had no way to reach one another except through the dangerous path of enemy-held streets. The buildings themselves were being peeled apart by artillery. Shells tore through upper floors, sending wooden beams crashing down and filling rooms with choking dust. Fires spread quickly, consuming rooftops and crawling along attics until whole terraces glowed behind a curtain of smoke. The wounded lay wherever they could, basements, hallways, kitchens, many too injured to be moved. Medics worked with dwindling supplies, improvising dressings, and sharing the last sips of water. Every corner of the shrinking perimeter carried signs of a fight stretched beyond its intended limits. Groups of 5 to 10 men now acted on instinct, following the nearest sergeant rather than formal orders. With radios silent and the front lines constantly shifting, these small clusters survived hour by hour, moving only when shells forced them to find stronger walls. The psychological strain built slowly but relentlessly. The men were experienced, but no amount of training could erase the realization settling in. They were alone. That realization crystallized in one of the clearest images described by survivors: a paratrooper looking through the broken window of a Dutch house and seeing German forces gathering in greater numbers than before. Infantry moved behind armor. Vehicles rolled forward with renewed confidence. The British were still fighting with courage, still holding their positions, but the imbalance was unmistakable. The bridge they had seized so boldly now felt like the edge of a precipice. Even then, determination did not falter. They continued to resist with the same disciplined resolve they had brought on the first day. But beneath the determination, hope itself began to dim. For the first time, the men understood that holding might no longer be enough, that Market Garden's grand design was collapsing far beyond the battered streets around them. And from this moment of recognition, the battle moved toward its harshest truth, the effort to save what still could be saved and the acceptance of what could no longer be reached. They entered this stage of the battle with the unmistakable awareness that the margin for survival was narrowing. Yet, within that shrinking space, they continued to push against the limits of what any force in their position could reasonably achieve. As the isolation deepened and the bridgehead eroded, their efforts took on a dual nature. On one side stood the remarkable things they had managed to preserve against overwhelming pressure. On the other, the equally undeniable reality of what lay forever out of reach. One of their greatest achievements was time itself. The northern end of the Arnhem Bridge, which the plan required them to hold for 48 hours, remained in British hands for nearly 4 days. This endurance was neither accidental nor symbolic. It altered German deployments at a crucial moment. The 2nd SS Panzer Corps, instead of regrouping for operations elsewhere, found itself compelled to redirect significant assets toward eliminating Frost's battalion. Armor that might have been used to block XXX Corps farther south, infantry that might have been repositioned to defend the approaches to the Ruhr, these were tied down because a few hundred men refused to relinquish their ground. During those days, they inflicted higher losses than their dwindling numbers might suggest. Armored cars and half-tracks attempting to force the bridge were destroyed at close quarters, German units probing. The perimeter repeatedly encountered unexpectedly sharp resistance. Even as ammunition grew scarce, British anti-tank teams held their fire for the narrowest of chances, choosing precision over volume. Every disabled German vehicle forced local commanders to reconsider routes, reconsider timing, reconsider the risk of pushing too aggressively. The defenders had transformed a handful of buildings into obstacles that disrupted the rhythm of an entire corps. Their endurance under severe deprivation was another accomplishment seldom matched in airborne operations. With resupply nearly impossible and communication unreliable, the small, shrinking groups within the perimeter still managed to maintain a functioning defense. Soldiers redistributed the last magazines between them. Medics worked with improvised materials. Officers reorganized squads as casualties shaved down their numbers. Exhaustion was constant, but discipline kept the perimeter intact far longer than circumstance should have allowed. Yet, despite these achievements, the men faced limits that no training or courage could overcome. They could not expand the defensive line to link up with the rest of the 1st Airborne Division. The city between them had become a maze of German positions, blocked roads, and shattered buildings. Even though their comrades were only a few kilometers away, the possibility of joining forces disappeared almost as soon as the radios began to fail. Nor could they hold the broader neighborhood required to sustain a viable bridgehead. The upper floors of the houses, initially valuable positions, collapsed under repeated shelling, leaving them exposed and forced into ever smaller spaces. With each room lost, the perimeter contracted, and with it, the hope of securing a corridor for reinforcement. The utter collapse of communications sealed their constraints. Messages rarely left the perimeter, and no guidance returned from Urquhart's headquarters. The defenders were left to judge the situation on intuition alone, unable to confirm whether XXX Corps was advancing toward them or halting miles away. In the end, their struggle embodied a single truth. They had fought to the outer edge of human capacity, yet they had been assigned a task that could not be won. And when the last pockets of resistance contracted around the bridge, the moment arrived when courage could no longer counter the weight tightening around them. It did not come with a dramatic charge or a single overwhelming strike. Instead, it settled slowly, like a gray mist, seeping into the broken rooms where the paratroopers held their ground. They had spent days pushing beyond exhaustion, clinging to the belief that rescue might still breach the distance between Arnhem and the advancing armor. But now the rhythm of battle told a different story. The pauses between German assaults shortened, the enemy's confidence sharpened, and the men sensed that the balance had tipped decisively out of their reach. The surroundings themselves carried the truth. Houses that had sheltered them since the first day were now half-collapsed shells, burning from within, beams cracking in showers of sparks. Smoke curled through doorways and drifted in long ribbons along stairwells, clinging to uniforms already stiff with dust. Walls trembled with every impact. Floors sagged under the weight of fire and destruction. Even standing still required effort, as if the air had thickened into something heavy and unwelcoming. Radios remained ominously silent. Operators hunched over their sets, adjusting dials, whispering call signs into static. Nothing came back. Every failed attempt deepened the isolation. They no longer knew how close the rest of the division was or whether any part of the city still held. The wider shape of the battle vanished. All that remained was the shrinking space they could still defend with fewer weapons, fewer men, fewer safe walls to stand behind. The defenders gathered in small clusters, 5 or 6 at a time, scattered throughout the ruins. Some crouched beneath shattered staircases, others pressed against brickwork, blackened by smoke. Many had lost contact with officers and did not know who led them anymore. The only certainty was that they were alone. Even the most seasoned soldiers stopped imagining that XX Corps might appear. The sounds of distant fighting no longer meant progress. They were simply echoes of a battle unfolding too far away to help. Through gaps in crumbling walls, they could see German forces massing with deliberate assurance. Infantry advanced behind armor, moving with a precision that revealed their growing dominance. Shells struck the remaining strongpoints, collapsing roofs and tearing open rooms that had served as last refuges. With each hit, the perimeter shrank, closing like a fist. It was here, amid the drifting smoke, the broken masonry, the fading hope, that the strategic heart of Market Garden finally ruptured. The fall of the northern end of the bridge was not just the loss of a position. It was the moment the operation's central aim became unattainable. Without that foothold, the corridor could never link. The vision of a swift thrust into Germany evaporated. They continued to resist where resistance remained possible. But the men understood with a clarity sharper than fear that the objective had died before they did. When the guns finally fell silent and the smoke settled above the fields and rooftops around Arnhem, the true cost of the operation could be tallied, and the numbers told a grim story. The 1st Airborne Division of Britain had landed with around 10,000 men, yet when the order came to withdraw across the Rhine, only just over 2,000 managed to make it. The remainder either lay dead, wounded beyond recovery, or were captured by German forces and sent into captivity. Many of those taken prisoner included senior officers and experienced commanders whose absence would be felt long after the battle. At the same time, the American airborne divisions that had taken part, in particular the 101st and the 82nd, suffered heavy losses in their efforts to seize and protect the string of bridges at Eindhoven-Grave and Nijmegen, and to guard the narrow supply route the troops dubbed Hell's Highway. Civilian residents of the Dutch towns and villages under the operation's path also paid a terrible price. Bombs, shelling, and reprisals by occupying German forces left many dead, homes destroyed, and families displaced, registering a human cost that went well beyond military figures. The strategic ambition behind the mission was breathtaking. By seizing a series of bridges through the Netherlands and crossing into Germany, the Allies hoped to make a bold dash into the Ruhr Valley and perhaps shorten the war. Yet, while many individual bridges had been taken, the most crucial one at Arnhem eluded capture, and with its loss, the entire corridor lost viability. Without that northern bridgehead, firmly in Allied hands, the armored advance ground to a halt, and the hoped-for thrust into Germany evaporated. Months of additional fighting would follow. The winter of 1944-45 in the northern Netherlands became a time of hardship and starvation. Villages still under German control experienced the so-called hunger winter, in which tens of thousands of civilians died as supplies broke down, railways were sabotaged, and relief could not reach them. The grand vision had slipped through the hourglass of time and terrain. In truth, the fault lines of the failure were many. Intelligence had misread the situation. The presence of well-prepared German armored units, including SS Panzer divisions repositioning in the Arnhem area, was underestimated. The British paratroopers had been dropped some 8 to 10 kilometers from their target bridge, choosing less obvious drop zones to avoid anti-aircraft fire, but in doing so, they gave the enemy time to prepare and interpose. Communications faltered catastrophically. The radios issued to the airborne units proved unreliable in Arnhem's terrain of forests, canals, and broken buildings. Any hope of coordinated reinforcement or relief was undermined when units could not talk, when commands never arrived, or when silent airwaves left troops isolated. The ground advance relied on a single narrow axis, the supply route known as Hell's Highway, making it vulnerable to delay, ambush, or demolition. Weather intervened. Mist and low clouds slowed resupply flights and glider landings, delaying the full buildup of forces. Tactics lacked flexibility. When a bridge at Nijmegen was finally seized, the armored columns paused rather than pressing onward, giving reaction time to German defenses. And ultimately, the scale of the task was too ambitious. Capturing a string of major bridges across the Rhine in 48 hours was a daring goal, but one that exceeded the capacity of the forces charged with achieving it under those conditions. In the years that followed, the name Arnhem would become more than a battle site. It would become a symbol of courage and sacrifice. The men of the airborne who held positions against overwhelming odds, trapped for days, low on ammunition, uncertain of relief yet refusing to yield, captured the admiration of veterans, historians, and civilians alike. At the same time, the same name would stand as a cautionary emblem of flawed planning and overreach, a marker of how strategic ambitions must be matched by logistical reality. The phrase, "a bridge too far," entered common usage, not merely as a title of a movie or book, but as an expression of endeavors that push beyond prudent limits. Memorials in the Netherlands bear witness each year to the men who jumped from the skies, fought house to house, and then withdrew under cover of darkness. The people of the Netherlands still honor them, recognizing both the liberation they helped bring and the civilian suffering that accompanied the campaign. Walking through the silent lanes of the Arnhem Oosterbeek War Cemetery, one sees row upon row of white stones, each representing a life given in that September of 1944. Local school children are taught the routes flown by gliders, the drop zones where paratroopers first touched Dutch earth, the bridges they fought to hold. Annual commemorations draw veterans, descendants, and Dutch citizens in quiet tribute to the bonds forged in war and the friendships sustained in peace. Military academies study the campaign not only for the valor of those who fought, but for its lessons, how intelligence, logistics, timing, and terrain intersect to determine success or failure. Arnhem became a classroom for the future, for how to plan, how to act, and how not to presume victory. Although the advance into Germany did not happen in the way planners had hoped in autumn 1944, and although the war would drag on through winter and into 1945, the stand at Arnhem changed how the war was seen. The sacrifice of the paratroopers, the risks taken, the house-to-house defense in a foreign land, they all became part of a larger narrative of Allied perseverance. In the evenings, when the wind stirs the poplars along the Rhine and the river flows quietly beneath the reconstructed road bridge, one can almost sense the ghostly passage of gliders, the hush of paratroopers waiting, the thunder of tanks, and the sorrow of lost friends. What began as a gamble of war became a testament to human endurance. In the end, the legacy of Operation Market Garden is not simply catalogued in numbers of dead or captured. It lives in the friendships forged between nations, the gratitude of liberated peoples, the memorials raised in quiet fields, and the stories told by those who lived to remember. It is written in the cold breath of autumn across the Dutch countryside, in the reflections of men whose youth bore the brunt of ambition, and in the understanding that even failure can leave something greater than what was expected. When night draws its gentle curtain over Arnhem, the Rhine continues its quiet passage beneath the bridge that once echoed with the sounds of war. The memories of courage, of unfinished hopes, and of strategic missteps drift softly in the cool northern wind. In this stillness, we remember the men who stepped into danger with a sense of duty that outshone their fears. Their stories linger in every shadow and ripple of the water, reminding us of the weight of history carried through time. And if you wish to wander through more nights like this, subscribe to WW2 History for Sleep and continue these peaceful journeys into the past.